Imagine being taken from your home not as a prisoner of war, not because of something you did, but as a guarantee. A guarantee that your tribe would stay neutral in someone else's conflict. That's what happened in Yathrib before the Prophet ever set foot in the city. 40 people taken as human collateral, and what happened next changed everything. In the last episode, we saw how the rivalry between the Aus and Khazraj was built. Geography, imbalance, inherited grievance. Two cousin tribes sharing the same city, the same ancestry, the same language, and somehow that similarity made the tension worse, not better. But here's the thing about rivalry. It can simmer for years without destroying a city. Tension isn't immediate collapse. Distrust isn't war. So what changed? What took Yathrib from a city of managed rivalry to a city that tore itself apart? One word, Buʿāth. Buʿāth was not a random clash. It wasn't a border skirmish or a minor dispute that got out of hand overnight. It was the breaking point of a system that had been under pressure for generations. Ibn Ishaq, one of the earliest and most authoritative biographers of the Prophet, peace be upon him, records the events of Buʿāth in detail as a part of the backdrop to the migration. Because what happened there is inseparable from understanding why Yathrib was ready to receive a prophet. The broad picture is clear. Years of accumulated tension between the Aus and the Khazraj finally erupted into an open, organized war. Not a skirmish, not a raid, a full battle with alliances, strategies, and consequences that rippled through the city for years afterwards. And critically, this time, it wasn't contained to just two tribes. Here's something that's easy to miss when we talk about the Aus and the Khazraj rivalry. Yathrib was never just two tribes. It was a layered, complex society, multiple groups, multiple interests, multiple loyalties, all operating in the same space at the same time. Living alongside the Arab tribes were several established Jewish communities, most notably Banu Qaynuqa', Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza. These weren't small or marginal groups. They were economically established, politically significant, and had lived in Yathrib long enough that the city's social fabric genuinely depended on how they positioned themselves. We'll be exploring who these communities were in more depth in the next episode, but their significance here was real and already established long before this moment. So when the Aus, fearing they were losing ground, sought military support, they reached out to Banu Qurayza and Banu Nadir. Now pause there for a moment. Think about what that tells you about the state of the city. The Aus weren't just asking for allies. They were asking communities who were already entangled in Yathrib's politics. The Jewish tribes weren't a unified bloc sitting safely on the sidelines. They had their own divisions, their own alignments, their own stakes in how this conflict played out. Banu Nadir and Banu Qurayza had long-standing ties to the Aus. Now, Banu Qaynuqa' leaned towards Khazraj. So when the Aus reached out, they weren't pulling in someone from the outside into the conflict. They were formalizing an alignment that had already existed beneath the surface. When the Khazraj discovered this alliance forming, they made a calculated move. They demanded 40 hostages, specifically from Banu Qurayza and Banu Nadir, not randomly. These were tribes with formal alliances tied to the Aus, binding communities that could bring them into the fight. The Khazraj knew exactly who they were targeting and why. The hostages were handed over. Under pressure, under the threat of what refusal might cost, 40 people were given up. But the Khazraj didn't stop there. They escalated. They threatened to kill the hostages unless the Jewish tribes went further. Not just staying out of the fight, but handing over their lands entirely, surrendering the very thing that gave these communities their standing in Yathrib. Now, this wasn't unusual in tribal Arabia, and that's precisely what makes it so telling. In the world of 7th century Arabia, a hostage wasn't just a prisoner. A hostage was a contract written in human lives. If your tribe broke its word, if you crossed the line you'd agreed not to cross, the hostages paid for it. Think about what it meant to be one of those 40 people. You didn't make the decision that landed you there. You were taken from your home, from your family, your community, not because of anything you personally did, but because of the politics of the leaders above you. Your life was now the price of someone else's loyalty. And the message the Khazraj were sending was unmistakable. We no longer trust your promises. We need something more than an agreement. We need leverage. Trust was no longer assumed. Trust required human collateral. Neutrality required leverage. And power required coercion. This is where things move from tense to tragic. The hostages had already been given. Now the Khazraj were demanding more, the lands, the ancestral homes, the very foundation of Banu Qurayza's standing in the city. The leader of Banu Qurayza, a person by the name of Kaʿb ibn Asad, he faced this ultimatum directly. Some members of his tribe were prepared to give in, cut the losses, save the 40, but Kaʿb drew a line. He would not sacrifice his tribe's ancestral homes. The land was not negotiable, whatever the cost, and so the hostages were killed. The result was the opposite of everything Khazraj intended. The Jewish tribes, angered by what had been done to them, allied themselves fully with the Aus, and the coercion had backfired completely. An attempt to prevent a wider war had made one inevitable. The Battle of Buʿāth erupted around 617 CE, roughly 5 years before the migration. By the time it was over, it had swallowed far more than anyone expected. Other tribes had joined in. What began between two cousins had become something much larger, much darker. The Aus were losing. Things looked desperate. And then they turned it around. They counterattacked and they won. But walk through that city the day after, look at who wasn't there anymore. The fathers who had seen wars before and knew how to end them. The elders whose word both sides still respected. The leaders who could sit across from an enemy and find a way back from the edge, gone. Both sides lost them, winners and losers alike. And that's what made Buʿāth unlike anything that had come before. The Aus won the battle, but Yathrib lost everything else. Because you can win in a war and still wake up in a broken city. You can defeat your enemy and still have no one left who knows how to build peace. Tribal honor had failed. The system that had held Yathrib together, fragile as it was, had finally given way, and there was nothing left to replace it. In the aftermath, one figure emerged as the most senior surviving leader, Abdullāh ibn Ubayy ibn Salūl. He was from the Khazraj tribe. He was politically connected, and by virtue of simply surviving, while so many others hadn't, he was now the most powerful individual in a broken city. Ibn Ishaq records that the people of Yathrib had been preparing to crown him as a king, a unifying figure who could end the endless cycle of tribal conflict by concentrating authority in one leader. But notice what kind of authority that would have been. His position wasn't built on unity. It wasn't built on genuine moral leadership or on the city choosing him because he had earned their trust through wisdom and justice. It was built on survival. He was the last man standing in a field of ruins. And that matters because a leadership built on survival is inherently fragile. It holds as long as there is no better option. The moment something more compelling appears, the foundations crack. There's a remarkable statement recorded about this moment. The day of Buʿāth was a gift that Allah granted to the Prophet. It was due to Buʿāth that their unity had been fragmented and their leaders were decimated. Now think about that framing. A catastrophic civil war described as a divine gift. Not because the suffering was good, but because of what it created in its aftermath. The younger generation of Yathrib, the ones who inherited wars they didn't start, who had grown up watching everything their elders built fall apart, they were no longer convinced that tribal dominance was the answer. They had seen where it led. They had seen it lead to 40 hostages, to an impossible choice, to elders lying dead on the battlefield, to a city that won a war and still lost everything. Buʿāth didn't just exhaust Yathrib, it disillusioned it. And disillusionment, real earned disillusionment, is one of the most powerful forces in human history. When people lose confidence in the system that has governed them, they don't just give up. They begin to search. Search for authority beyond tribe. Search for justice beyond retaliation. Search for something stable enough to actually hold. Buʿāth didn't create faith, but it created space. and just 5 years later, that space would be filled. In the next episode, we look at another layer of Yathrib, one that had already been speaking about prophets, about revelation, and divine guidance for generations. Because the city was not spiritually empty when Islam arrived. It was already primed, and that's exactly where we turn next.